Hello, students of European history. Today's lecture is on decolonization or giving up empire. Now, if I was going to start this with a contextualization, I'd probably talk about the earlier periods of colonization, the one that happened with the Spanish and the Portuguese in the 1500s or so, or I could even do the new imperialism period of the late 19th and early 20th century. Maybe talk about motivations and things like that, depending on what the thesis of this particular thing would be. My thesis today is really World War II kills the empire, and then I'm going to explain the process by which many of these states became free. As I said, thesis today, World War II killed the empire. Basically, after World War II, the European states, we're really talking about Britain and France for the most part, were really quite broke and really didn't have the wherewithal to keep these former colonies in check or under control. They were simply out of money and were trying just to rebuild themselves. So that could be one of the reasons that World War II killed the empire. Another one would be that the Nazis and the extremes that they went to try to destroy groups of people really discredits racism. The Nazis are kind of the logical end of the racism, the sort of Darwinian racism that starts in the 19th century. If people start to view different races of people as different species, and there are good species and bad species, and species that are fit for survival, and there are species that are fit for destruction, well, eventually you will start to think about genocide and try that. And so when the Nazis do this, it makes all forms of racism, I think, unpalatable and disgusting. Another thing that happens is the confidence that the European states had when they were doing the new imperialism bit. The confidence was shaken. You think about how they went into these different parts of the world in an attempt to civilize people, that so-called white man's burden. Well, the so-called civilizers, or the most civilized people, tried to just slaughter each other and killed tens of millions of people in a world war. How civilized are they? How superior are they if this is what they're up to? And do they really have anything to teach people around the world? Another thing that's happening in World War II from the British and American perspective is the attempt to create democracy around the world. And how is it that if Britain and France and the United States and these other countries were fighting a war for democracy, how is it that many of them have enslaved countries, in a sense, in parts of their sphere of influence or in parts of their empires? If democracy is such a great thing to fight for in World War II, then certainly democracy would be worth something fighting for as against the empire of these nations. Also, these nations had, you can imagine, their own nationalist movements, independent of anything that they might have learned from the Europeans, but they also have European-type schools that are set up in these countries, and they learn about liberalism, they learn about nationalism, they learn about how people had aspired to have nation states and how nation states were powerful and good and so on. And so they learn about European nationalist movements, want to have their own nationalist movement based on European ideas, in addition to just not wanting to be controlled by foreigners or outsiders in a kind of native nationalist way. India was a very important part of the British Empire. It was probably the most important part of the British Empire, and there was a nationalist movement, or a couple of nationalist movements, early on in the 20th century. The Indian National Congress, for example, led by a man by the name of Gandhi and another man by the name of Nehru, and then a Muslim League with a man by the name of Jinnah. All of these guys are pro-independence. They want to have nation states. They want to have autonomy. They want to have independence from Britain. In the 1920s, they were trying to hurt Britain, where Britain, had the greatest advantage in controlling India economically. And so boycotts began in the 1920s. And this does wake up Britain's and British industry to the problem of India and the problem that Indians did want their own country. World War I was a period of time in which the Indians really supported Britain. World War II as well, but with a kind of understanding that after World War II, India would get independence for supporting Britain during World War II. Churchill was really against giving up India as a conservative. He wanted to maintain empire and maintain, tradition. You might remember that Churchill is defeated in 1945, and the Labour Party is running Britain, and the Labour Party is much more willing to get out of India or quit India. And they leave rather hastily. They didn't stick around and try to help the new government maintain peace and good relations between different kinds of Indians. It was almost as if all of the Indians could be united in wanting to get rid of the British, but once the British were gone, they were at each other. And so horrible violence develops in India. A kind of civil war develops between different religious sects. And then a huge migration occurs with millions of people moving to places where their particular religious confession is the majority. And so India is partitioned. British India turns into 3 states, a Hindu state called India and 2 Muslim states, East Pakistan and West Pakistan. Eventually, East Pakistan will become the nation of Bangladesh after a civil war around 1970 or so that the Indians help the people of East Bangladesh break away from West Pakistan or just Pakistan. You can see up at the far northern part of this map is a place called Kashmir, which is disputed between India and Pakistan. You can also see Bangladesh or East Pakistan on the right side of the map. Britain had a tendency to give up its empire somewhat willingly. Britain wanted to maintain links with these countries that they formerly controlled, wanted them to be a part of the British Commonwealth. For example, they wanted to create democracy in these states, but in order to stick around and try to help these fledgling countries get on their feet, that would have cost a lot of money. Britain doesn't have money at the end of World War II. Britain can barely feed itself and take care of itself at the end of World War II. And so, I think about how British people or Britons wouldn't want to pay for the colonies that they had if they're not really benefiting from them in any way. And so they just leave, they just give up, once again, rather hastily, and really don't have democracy flourish or really a good economic system set up in these states. If, and this did happen sometimes, if there was a violent independence movement, oftentimes this hastened the withdrawal of the British. Nobody wanted to be the last British soldier, killed in some sort of imperial conflict, and so that was the case with most of these places. One notable exception was Kenya, and in Kenya there were white settlers who lived there and controlled the land and controlled the government and so on. And so they tried to they tried to beat back the independence movement of the Kenyans for a while. In the end, they saw that they were completely, outnumbered, and there's no way to keep people under control who don't want to be kept under control without really horrible violence. And so gave up even in Kenya. Indonesia was a place that used to be called the Dutch East Indies, and it was taken over by the Japanese in World War II. When the Japanese defeated nations like Britain and France and the United States at the beginning of World War II, it inspired a lot of Asian people in particular that, these Western powers were not invincible, that white people were capable of being beaten by Asian people, and it gave them a lot of self-confidence. Well, when the Dutch came back, Dutch chased out of Indonesia during World War II, when the Dutch came back and wanted things to resume or be status quo from normal from before the war, now the Indonesian people rose up and fought the Dutch. And the Dutch, once again, as a country that had been conquered by the Nazis and so on, was not powerful enough to be able to put the Indonesians back in their place and return to the good old days of colonialism and empire. So the Dutch lose that fight, and the Indonesians win their bid for independence. So sadly, once again, democracy doesn't flourish there. The strong man who becomes leader of Indonesia is a man by the name of Sukarno at first. You may not know too much about Indonesia. As you can see from the map, it is just a huge series of islands, and it's a very populous state, actually. It's the most populous Muslim state in the entire world. I think there's around 300 million people or more who live on all those various places. Indochina, or what we might call Vietnam, is a fight that the French have at first. There is a nationalist and communist, we kind of talked about that last time, that is a possibility. A man by the name of Ho Chi Minh demanded the independence from France after World War II, and France was really, unlike Britain, unwilling to give up its empire. It had a very different experience in World War II, being humiliated in 1940, and then being helped out to be liberated from the Nazis. They really had a kind of Napoleon complex, as I said. They wanted to keep a hold of their empire, and so they fought Ho Chi Minh's nationalist communist group from about 1946 to 1954. There is a final kind of very large battle that happens at a place called Dien Bien Phu, which leads to the French giving up. And then Vietnam is divided between a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam, the North Vietnam being that communist nationalist state, and South Vietnam being a kind of capitalist, let's call it a dictatorship. The United States, with the Truman Doctrine and just fearing that the Cold War was allowing the spread of communism, took over from the French and started to have military equipment sent to the South Vietnamese, military advisors, and then finally huge numbers of American troops in a fight against the North Vietnamese. It's a Cold War proxy fight. The Soviet Union is sending arms to the North Vietnamese in order to kill Americans, and this ends in the 1970s with an American withdrawal. There's a nice map for you. Hanoi is at the top. That was in North Vietnam. The southern part you can't really see there. There was a place called Saigon, which becomes Ho Chi Minh City. I think you're used to that sort of thing. Algeria is really a much more important fight for the French. Algeria revolts against France in 1954. The situation there were about 1 million white French men and women controlling about 9 million North African Algerians, Muslim Algerians. And the French, of course, had all the power, all the land, and this had gone back to the beginning of French control of Algeria, which goes back to Charles X in 1830. A French-Algerian war breaks out in 1954, ending finally in 1961. A very nasty fight. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Terrible atrocities committed by both sides. One thing that happens in France as a result of this is the hero of World War II, Charles de Gaulle, suggests that the French change their constitution, allow for a much more powerful presidency, and then he would become president of France and solve the Algeria problem. All of that happens. They change the constitution. The French president becomes very powerful. But when de Gaulle gets into power, he realizes that, once again, you can't, with a small number of people, try to control people who wanted their independence, who wanted their nationalism, and ends up letting Algeria go. He's kind of selling out the million Europeans, or the Pieds Noirs, who live in Algeria, and he's also selling out the Muslim soldiers, the Harkis, who had supported the French through this conflict. The Pieds Noirs and the Harkis flee Algeria at the end of the war, and they come back to France, or they go to France. And this is the beginning of a large-scale migration of North African people into France, something that continues up till today. Here's just some various kinds of images from that conflict. You can see an assassinated military officer, French military officer, there on the lower left. Africa in the late 1950s and 1960s was given its independence by European countries. Belgium frees the Congo, France gives up its many states, Britain starts to give up its states, and so on. 1960 is known as the year of independence. A lot of African states get independence in 1960. Some of those African states that became that were freed to have their own independence became a kind of battleground between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union pumped arms into these various states and supported their own, either capitalism or communism, or capitalist or communist dictators. And so it's really kind of a proxy conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, sadly. It's not going to do anything for their economic development or peace or anything like that. Here's a nice map of the decolonization of Africa. You can see with those sort of odd pillar-shaped things that there were a number of violent struggles for independence. There was also some apartheid states where white people were controlling people of color, and those eventually become much more fair and much more equitable states. The Middle East is kind of a different thing, has a different kind of situation. Britain gave the nations of the Middle East independence after World War II. Um, Israel was created in 1948. Really, the Arab-Israeli problem. Israel was well, before Israel existed, it was Palestine, and it was um, inhabited by Jews and by Palestinian Muslims. And there were an increasing number of Jews after World War II who went to Israel and trying to fulfill that Zionist dream of Theodor Herzl. Well, Britain didn't really have the wherewithal to once again kind of solve the problem between the Arabs and the Israelis in Palestine, and so it turns it over to the United Nations. Israel declares itself an independent nation. The United Nations wanted to create a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. But sadly, when the Israelis declare their independence, they are attacked immediately by Palestinians and a whole bunch of other Arab states. And there are a number of Arab-Israeli wars that happen: 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. And every single one of them ends up in an Israeli victory, and then also with the Israelis taking territory away from the Arabs to the point where they've taken over a lot of territory and they can kind of deal back some of that territory over time. The United States in these conflicts supported Israel, the Soviets supported the Arabs, and it was a kind of proxy fight as well. Something interesting happened in 1956 with Egypt nationalizing the Suez Canal, taking it away from the British and French investors who owned it. Kind of makes sense. The Egyptians were not profiting from it in the way that they should, being that this is a feature of their country. Egypt did this, and Britain and France and Israel were worried about Egyptian control of the Suez Canal. Israel feeling like the Egyptians would be blockading them or not letting ships bound for Israel through, and so on. So the three of them get together to seize the Suez Canal back from the Egyptians, and then the weirdest thing happened. And that weird thing that happened was that the United States and the Soviet Union both agreed that European imperialism was wrong, and they wanted then Britain, France, and Israel to get out, which Britain, France, and Israel had to do. The two superpowers demanded they're going to have to do that. It really shows you in 1956 that Europe is really a long, long ways away from controlling the world like it did around 1900. It's the other superpowers that get to decide that. Here's a nice map of the Middle East. You can see Egypt, you can see the Suez Canal. Some different kinds of images from Arab-Israeli wars. You can see Israel seizing land after these wars. 1967 was a really big war in which the Israelis seized a lot of land. They knew that the Arab states were about to attack them, and so attacked first, and were able to get places like the Golan Heights and the West Bank, and even the Sinai Peninsula. We'll talk more about this at the end of the war, at the end of the year when the AP test is done. So the legacy of decolonization or colonization is that the countries that were freed either violently or peacefully were still very much culturally and economically tied to their former masters. This is something called neocolonialism. Just because they aren't controlling them outright, it doesn't mean that that the economic ties that had existed before or the cultural ties that had existed before would go away by any means. Sadly, many of these states, both in Asia and then also in Africa, continue to be suppliers of raw materials that these industrial nations would do something with and then maybe send back to those countries to purchase various kinds of goods from the former colonial masters. They also were attempting over many years to become more successful economically, maybe trying to industrialize. They borrow money from the West, or they borrow money from the capitalist world, which then sadly oftentimes gets squandered, and then these nations are indebted to the industrial countries or to the Western capitalist nations. That doesn't really do anything for them. There is independence oftentimes, but getting democracy to happen, just like in Eastern Europe after World War I, it's really difficult to establish a democracy without kind of long-term sort of organic movement in that way. You can't just free a country that had always been controlled and expect everybody to be suddenly very democratic. And also, the colonial masters had drawn borders that didn't really take into account the different kinds of people, different ethnicities, different religions, and so on. And so there's lots of ethnic strife that happens with many of these areas that are freed after World War II. Some of them particularly heinous conflicts, like what happened in Rwanda between the Hutu and the Tutsi people, really not too long ago. And the dictatorship, of course, is something that happens frequently as well. Poverty, as a rule, is something that many of these nations have to struggle with even today. Natural disasters happen from time to time, and then they have a very hard time recovering from. Decolonization, I think, proves to us that Europe is no longer dominant. It isn't the same nation, or they aren't the same continent that once went out and took over all the world and tried to do white man's burden and civilize people and all of that kind of stuff. Colonization becomes ideologically and financially unsustainable as a result of World War II. Sadly, though, neocolonialism still exists with loans and trade agreements. And then something that we'll talk about here coming up very soon is how immigration from the former colonies to Europe really changes European society quite a bit. You have, for the first time, people of color, and then also people of different religions moving to Europe, as the cartoon says, starting around 1955. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and there will be more in the coming days. Thanks so much, and have a great day. As usual, do the reading and do the reading quiz, and that counts as your ABA for the day. Thanks, bye.